55 years ago, a 6-year-old boy vanished in the heart of the city of London, in just a few short minutes, without a cry, without a trace, leaving his family plunged into an unsolved void. Police believed it was a case of getting lost that would soon be clarified, but the search quickly hit a dead end. The file gradually went cold, and the name Oliver Bennett was buried in the stacks of papers sealed in storage archives. For decades, no body, no new witnesses, no leads strong enough to overturn the initial assumption, until the case was regarded as an irredeemable mystery. Yet, more than half a century later, from a data source entirely outside the police system, a small detail unexpectedly emerged. A detail suggesting the entire story may have been misunderstood from the very beginning. Before delving deeper into this shocking City of London cold case, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love stories where the truth has to wait decades to be revealed, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. City of London, one evening in 1969, when the yellow lights from the street lamps cast down onto the wet gray stone pavement, and the sound of underground trains echoed up from below like the steady breathing of the city, Oliver Bennett disappeared without leaving any prior sign. It was the hour when the rush of people finishing work was pouring out of the underground entrances, dark coats brushing past one another, leather shoes tapping rhythms on the pavement, fragmented conversations blending with the distant sound of car horns. Oliver, 6 years old, much shorter than the crowd around him, was standing near the communal entrance leading to the block of flats not far from the Barbican, where the light grew dimmer and shadows intertwined between the steps and concrete walls. The last time adults saw him, Oliver was standing slightly to the right of the entrance, his body turned sideways as if preparing to take another step, one hand hanging loosely at his side, the other gently swinging in the habit of a child who had just been told to wait for a moment. He was not crying, not running, not appearing panicked. His posture was so calm that no one thought that in just a few minutes, that calmness would become an unfillable void. Oliver's direction of movement at that moment was unclear, whether he was facing the flow of people or towards the block. No one could be sure. The surrounding sounds were the screech of underground trains, the closing of metal doors, the hurried footsteps, and the low voices of weary adults after a day's work. Time passed very slowly, so slowly that no one noticed it was dragging on, until those few minutes exceeded the normal threshold, and Oliver did not appear where he was expected. At first it was just impatient waiting, then a strange feeling when his name was called once, twice, the adult's voice ringing out in the familiar space, but with no response. The family began walking along the corridor, looking down the steps, peering into the shadows, calling Oliver louder, more urgently, the tone in their voice already changing. They walked faster, opening communal doors, asking people who had just passed if they had seen a little boy, but the answers were only vague shakes of the head or confused looks. No one saw, no one heard, no one remembered passing a 6-year-old child in the past few minutes, as if Oliver had never been standing there. The city continued to move, trains kept running, lights stayed on, the crowd dispersed and vanished into the streets, while Oliver's absence became increasingly clear, heavy, and undeniable. When the family returned to the flat without the boy, when all possible places had been searched in vain, they stood silent for a few short seconds, long enough to understand that Oliver had not just got lost in the block, that this period of silence had exceeded the limits of safety. The call was made in breathless tension, the voice on the other end recorded the information, and in that moment, on what seemed like an ordinary evening in the City of London, in 1969, Oliver Bennett was officially reported missing. City of London police received the call in a rhythm very different from the usual lost child reports. The duty officer did not routinely ask, "Have you checked everywhere in the house?" and advise waiting longer, but immediately requested a series of minimum details to activate an emergency response: the child's full name, age, approximate height, hair color, clothing last seen in, health condition, whether he knew how to travel on trains alone, whether he had a habit of running to neighbors, or down to the playground. The voice on the other end had to repeat several times, because the Bennett family was still out of breath after running along the corridor. But the more they listened, the clearer one thing became: This was not the scene of a child hiding on the stairs and popping out a few minutes later. Oliver had disappeared in a crowded area, in a very short space of time, and no one in the block answered, "Yes, I just saw him." Within minutes, a police team was dispatched to the address, without waiting for daylight, without waiting for the standard time to classify it as missing. The night-duty CID investigator went along, carrying a notebook and a professional reflex. If delayed, all possible paths widen exponentially. When they arrived, the city still echoed with underground trains, the flow of people had thinned but not stopped entirely, and the yellow lights still cast long shadows on the communal entrance, exactly where Oliver was last seen. The investigator did not start with emotional questions, but with structure. Tell me the last moment that can be confirmed. Who saw him? Where, when? How was the time remembered? He separated the family into 2 short interview points to avoid them unconsciously synchronizing memories, requiring each person to recount independently in reverse order, starting from realizing Oliver was missing, working backwards minute by minute. That night, a rough timeline was built right in the corridor, a straight line, time markers, dashes, each dash accompanied by the source of information. Last seen was placed in the center like a pin, but the investigator did not let it remain a vague statement. He forced it to become a verifiable marker. Oliver standing at the entrance, posture slightly tilted, facing direction unclear, sound of train passing, dim light. All the previous descriptions were included as a living scene description, but he needed something more important. Which minute? The family said just a few minutes, but a few minutes was no help. When needing to narrow down, the investigator asked, at that moment, did you hear a train arriving or departing? Because train schedules have rhythms. Did you hear the door closing bell at the station? Did anyone just return home with a parcel? Did they check the clock in the lobby? When was Oliver's name first called? When did someone leave the flat to search and meet someone else in the corridor? Those seemingly trivial questions were his way of pinning time with anchors. In reality, train sounds, bells, habits, landmarks. At the same time, he ordered another officer down to Barbican Underground Station to record footfall, question staff on duty, check for any incidents in that time frame, see if any children had been reported lost. Another went along the pavements around the block, knocking on ground floor flats that could see the entrance, asking very specifically, in the past 20 minutes, did you see a small boy walking alone? Did you see anyone carrying a child? Did you hear a child crying? Meanwhile, the investigator built last known direction in professional terms. If Oliver walked off himself, which way was most logical? If someone led him, which way had least light? If someone wanted to disappear from sight, which path avoided the front? The City of London at night had cameras at some points, but in 1969, there was no dense CCTV, so he prioritized bottlenecks. Places where people had to pass station exits, junctions, underpasses, side gates. The uncontrolled time period, window of opportunity, was initially determined, starting from the minute Oliver left site, ending at the minute the police call was made, but in investigation, the real window had to be narrower, and to do that, he needed to lock 3 key markers. 1. The last minute Oliver could be confirmed at the entrance. 2. The first minute the family actively started searching and calling his name. 3. The minute the police call was answered. These 3 markers, if aligned, would create an accurate time frame for narrowing down. If not, all priority tactics would be based on a skewed foundation, and then that very night, the first abnormal sign appeared not from a footprint or object, but from time itself. The adults in the Bennett family, when interviewed separately, gave 3 different versions of the last seen minute. One insisted it was right after hearing a train arrive. Another said before, when the crowd was still pouring out from the station. The third believed Oliver was seen at the entrance, after a neighbor returned home, and greeted them. Not just off by a few minutes. If those markers were correct, they could not all be true. The start searching marker was also off. Some remembered calling Oliver's name as soon as they turned away. Others said they waited a bit, thinking he was playing somewhere. The call police marker seemed certain, but even it shifted when cross-checked with who remembered picking up the phone, who was standing nearby, who ran to ask neighbors one last time. The investigator looked at the timeline sheet, saw the time dashes not aligned, but sliding like saw teeth. He did not blame anyone. Memory under stress always self-corrects to make sense, but for investigation, that mismatch was a red flag. If the timeline was wrong from the start, the narrowing would be wrong too, and every passing minute would lead them further astray. He immediately changed tactics. Instead of fixing one last scene based on the accounts, he created two parallel scenarios, one earlier, one later, then ordered narrowing, based on the worst case assuming Oliver disappeared earlier than the best account, meaning a perpetrator, if any, had more time to remove him from the area. While officers at the scene continued knocking doors, scanning bottlenecks, the investigator returned to the exact spot at the entrance where Oliver was last seen, stood from the adult's viewpoint, and asked the crucial question: a 6-year-old child disappears here, in the yellow light, amid train sounds and crowds, without leaving a sound loud enough for anyone to remember, so either Oliver walked into a shadow the adults could not see, or a hand led him away in a way that the crowd saw as normal. And to distinguish between those two possibilities, they needed one thing right now: to stop time in the file from sliding, to pin it to the ground with verifiable markers, before London's night closed and every trace of those fateful minutes was erased by the next day's crowds. As most of the city gradually quietened into late night, the search for Oliver Bennett was deployed in a cold and disciplined manner, quite unlike the sweeping, reassuring operations often seen. The investigator required each team before setting out to answer clearly: what was the working hypothesis, what signs would confirm it, and what signs must be ruled out in the shortest time. This approach aimed to prevent emotion from leading, because just a few hours in the wrong direction could wipe out all fragile traces from the previous evening under the next morning's crowds. The first route prioritized was the underground around Barbican, because if Oliver left on his own, this was the fastest way for him to fall out of control. But the left on his own hypothesis was only accepted if real barriers did not exceed a 6-year-old's ability. One team went down to Barbican and nearby stations on the Central Line and Metropolitan Line, cross-referencing train schedules by minute, questioning duty staff about any reports of lost children in the suspected time frame, checking logbooks for any incidents causing crowds to bunch or interrupt, situations that could obscure an unusual act. No reports, no records, no one remembered intervening for a boy alone. The ticket barriers, stairs, corridors were all bright spots where a small lost child would immediately draw attention. The second route was buses, around Barbican, Moorgate, Aldersgate. Officers did not ask vaguely, but focused on two factors: nearest stops a child could reach, and intervals between buses to see if there were gaps long enough for a strange act to occur unnoticed. Drivers did not remember asking children off. Passengers did not remember giving way to a small boy. Moreover, stops were on bright axes, where a child standing alone could hardly blend into the crowd without notice. The third route was pedestrian paths and communal corridors, short, familiar roads that make adults complacent. Here, searching did not target physical evidence in a criminal sense, but deviations from daily order: a usually closed side door now open, a corridor light off early, a bin pulled out of place. Each detail was recorded, photographed, marked relative to where Oliver was last seen, but nothing yet strong enough to pull the entire effort towards it. The fourth route followed the Thames embankment within reasonable radius, not assuming the worst, but to rule it out early and avoid resources being wasted on the river. Steps down to the water, sound-swallowing shadows, night duty points were all checked. No signs of haste, no skid marks, no one heard unusual noises. While teams scanned, the investigator focused on collecting and organizing the first physical details as time anchors: a small item at the edge of the path, a fresh scratch on the railing, a patch of wet ground trodden darker around it. They were cross-referenced with the early, late-time scenarios built earlier. When placing routes on the same axis, the numbers began to speak for themselves. Distances from the entrance to reasonable disappearance points, all required continuous movement speed beyond a normal 6-year-old's without stopping and without notice in lit sections. Barriers, high steps, heavy doors, crowds, should have prompted at least one adult intervention for safety, but there was none. In terms of time, No scenario allowed Oliver to follow a logical route alone, while avoiding all eyes in the determined window. Either he would appear at unsupported points, or disappear faster than realistically possible. More importantly, the distribution of anomalies did not form a path gradually moving away, but clustered near the entrance area, where light and shadow intertwined, where crowds could make a leading away act look normal. The investigator spread the map on the table, placed the markers, then reduced the question to a verifiable proposition. If Oliver moved himself, there must be at least one of three things: reliable witness, coherent movement trail, or safety intervention. None appeared. From there, the working hypothesis adjusted naturally. Without dramatic declaration, focus shifted from where did Oliver go to how was Oliver taken. This did not mean concluding crime, it simply reflected the only way to explain why data from underground, buses, pedestrian paths and riverbank all mismatched a 6-year-old's ability to move alone. That very night, the tasks of the teams were reallocated. They returned to the bottlenecks where an adult could stand without drawing attention, where a child could be led away amid the flow of people, without creating any memorable sound or sight. The search continued, but the axis of thinking had shifted from tracing long paths to dissecting short moments, from pursuing the feeling of getting lost to reading signs that Oliver's absence was not the result of a journey, but of a decision made very close to where he was last seen. By dawn, as the directed search routes were successively ruled out without producing a logical path, the investigator returned to the only place where more information could still be extracted: human memory. But instead of interviewing according to a list of names, or in order of who arrived first or left later, he divided witnesses into spatial layers, based on their physical distance from the point where Oliver was last seen. The closest layer consisted of those who could look directly into the entrance and communal corridor: ground floor neighbors, someone just returning home from the station, someone standing smoking in the corner of the wall. The next layer was those on the edge of vision: night duty staff, people passing by then turning in another direction, someone waiting for another in the shadows near the side entrance. Further out were those with only indirect contact with the scene: station staff, bus drivers, night vendors, people who did not see Oliver, but saw the crowd that Oliver had blended into for those few short minutes. Each layer was interviewed separately, using the same set of standardized questions, but the investigator paid particular attention to what seemed the smallest thing: how they determined time. Not asking what time, but before or after the train sound, before or after you locked the door, before or after you glanced at the wall clock, because people remember events better than numbers. The initial statements sounded consistent with one another, but when placed side by spatial layer, cracks began to appear. Someone in the closest layer insisted they had seen Oliver standing at the entrance about a few minutes before the family first called his name. Another person, also in this layer, was certain that when they passed by, the corridor was already empty, and the light was reflecting off the wet stone floor, with no child's shadow. The two statements did not contradict in imagery, but in sequence. In the edge layer, one witness remembered hearing a child's name being called as they turned into the side path, but believed that call came after they heard the train depart. Meanwhile, a night duty worker in the block placed that call before the train, based on their habit of checking the clock whenever a train passed. When these before-after markers were drawn on paper, they did not form a straight sequence, but created small loops where the same event was placed in two different positions on the timeline. The investigator did not rush to resolve the contradictions. He let them exist and continued digging deeper, because erroneous memories rarely appear in isolation. When interviewing the outer layer, those who did not see Oliver, but saw the crowd, the minute discrepancies became clearer. One person remembered very clearly checking their watch when boarding the bus, and insisted that time was later than when the family called the police, something impossible if the initial timeline was correct. Another believed they heard a train arriving while standing next to a man carrying a child, but was not sure if it was Oliver, or just a family finishing work late. These accounts, if heard individually, could be dismissed as noise, but when arranged by spatial layer, they created an unsettling picture. Each layer had its own last scene, and those last scene moments refused to align. At this point, The investigator paused and did something that seemed counterintuitive. He crossed out the single last seen box on the timeline board. Instead, he drew multiple different markers, each attached to a witness layer, and connected them with dotted lines. This change was not theoretical, it had direct consequences for the entire search effort. Without an absolutely confirmed final moment, every assumption about direction, speed of movement, and time window had to be re-examined. The underground and bus routes had been ruled out based on a time marker that was inherently uncertain. The anomalies near the entrance might have occurred minutes earlier or later, a gap enough to completely alter the lighting context, crowd density, and level of public attention. The investigator began cross-referencing again. Supposing Oliver was last seen earlier than the common account, the uncontrolled window was wider, and leading him away amid a dense crowd would be easier. Conversely, if the final marker was later, the chance of Oliver standing alone long enough to turn off in another direction increased, but this contradicted the data from the checked routes. Neither scenario fitted perfectly, and that very mismatch led to the most important realization of the night. The timeline used to guide the search from the start was not a solid foundation, but a temporary compromise between self-adjusting memories. Recognizing this, the investigator changed how questions were asked in subsequent interviews. He no longer sought answers to Oliver was there at what time, but sought moments independent of Oliver, when the corridor light was turned on or off, when someone locked their door, when a specific train departed, when a shift started or ended. These unrelated markers, when pieced together, created a more objective time frame, in which Oliver's absence appeared as a moving void, rather than a fixed point. That void drifted through the spatial layers, sometimes lying close to the entrance, sometimes already shifted to the crowd's edge, but refusing to stay in any position long enough to be called last seen. As the sky began to lighten, the timeline board in the temporary operations room was no longer a straight line, but a network of markers and voids. The investigator stood before it, understanding that the past hours had not been wasted. They had eliminated a dangerous illusion that finding the exact final moment would allow everything afterwards to be traced. In Oliver Bennett's disappearance, that moment did not exist as a single point, and accepting that truth, albeit late, forced the investigation to rebuild its foundations, not on a neat but flawed time marker, but on how a child could vanish in the city, without anyone able to point and say with certainty, it was exactly then. As the time markers broke down and last seen ceased to be a fixed point, the crime scene in the traditional sense also began to dissolve. The investigator returned to the entrance area where Oliver Bennett was last seen with a seemingly paradoxical question: if a serious event had occurred here, why was there no crime scene? No physical traces in the way one might expect in sudden disappearances, no scuffle marks on the stone floor, no scattered belongings, no skid marks or blood. No one heard a cry or impact strong enough to lodge in memory. Everything remained in its proper place, orderly to a suspicious degree, as if Oliver had never stood there. This very cleanliness forced the investigation to shift from searching for traces to reading behavior. The investigator started with elimination. If there had been a struggle, even brief, there must be at least one indicator: unusual sound amid the crowd, someone turning to look, a movement slowing the flow of people. There was none. If Oliver had been dragged away against his will, a 6-year-old child's natural reflex would be to resist with cries or movements, but no one in the witness layers remembered that. These conclusions were not speculative, but placed alongside the earlier data. Human memory might skew minutes, but rarely collectively forgets a cry in an enclosed space. From this, the investigator reconstructed the minimum behavioral sequence needed for Oliver to disappear without creating a crime scene. Approach, separate, depart. Each step having to occur smoothly, blending into the normal rhythm of the evening. In the approach step, the question was no longer who, but how. A stranger approaching a child in a crowded public space would usually create a strange moment, probing glances, hesitation, but if that person appeared in a legitimate role in that context, the strangeness vanished. The investigator listed legitimate images: a parent leading a child, a familiar person bending down to talk, an adult appearing to know the child well. No need for long words, just a short sentence: A familiar gesture was enough to blur the boundary between stranger and known in the eyes of bystanders. Oliver, according to the family's description, was not a child who reacted strongly to adults without signs of threat. This, placed alongside the scene's silence, became a piece too significant to ignore. The separation step, the most dangerous, if done clumsily, was precisely where there were no signs at all. Separating a child from a shared space without drawing attention has only two ways: either the child willingly follows, or the separation occurs in a transitional gap where people are already accustomed to dispersal. Darker entrance, obscured corner between two light sources, moment when the crowd's rhythm shifts with a train arriving or departing. The anomalies recorded earlier, when placed into this model, were no longer isolated dots. They lay exactly at those transitional edges, where light was uneven, and crowd attention was fragmented. No scuffle marks, because there was no scuffle. No dropped items, because Oliver was not dragged. The departure step completed the behavioral chain. An adult leading a child away from the entrance does not create a memorable image in collective memory, unless something was amiss. The long routes had been ruled out in the directed search. That did not negate departure, but narrowed it. Departure did not have to be a long journey. It could be a few dozen meters into a side path, a door, a waiting vehicle. Therefore, the failure to find traces on the underground, buses or Thames embankment did not weaken this behavioral hypothesis, but strengthened it. Departure had occurred before Oliver had a chance to reach those routes. The investigator began cross-referencing behavior with the skewed time from earlier. Without a single last scene, the approach moment could have occurred earlier than initially assumed, while the family still believed Oliver was waiting. This explained why closest layer witnesses gave mismatched descriptions. They did not see the same moment, but different slices of a short process. One saw Oliver standing alone, another passed when Oliver was already gone. Both were correct within their own time frames. The crime scene was thus not an explosion point, but a blurred zone, where smooth behavior concealed the event. Gradually, from no crime scene, another realization formed. The absence of traces was not random or fortunate circumstance, but the result of deliberate approach. Someone had chosen the timing, location, and method so that their behavior resembled hundreds of other harmless ones occurring simultaneously. This required no violence. It required understanding of the space and the city's rhythm. The investigator did not record this as a final conclusion, but as a new reading direction for the entire file. Oliver did not disappear because of chaos, but because of smoothness. As morning fully broke, the entrance area was crowded again as usual. No one pointed to a crack or footprint and said this is where it happened. But in the investigation file, a new crime scene had been established, not with police tape or chalk, but with behavioral analysis. A crime scene with no traces, no struggle, yet speaking clearly about how a 6-year-old child could be approached, separated, and led away in the city of London, without leaving those left behind anything to hold onto, except silence. As behavioral analysis replaced trace searching, the investigation direction naturally shifted towards the people regularly present around the entrance area. Familiar faces enough not to draw attention, yet close enough to fit the approach, separate, depart model that had formed. City of London Police compiled a list not by criminal record, but by presence, who appeared regularly during rush hour, who had legitimate reason to stand at the light transition edges, who was familiar with train rhythms, crowd rhythms. The list quickly lengthened, but then narrowed as investigators applied one single criterion: the ability to stand near a child without being seen as a stranger. From this one name emerged sooner than others: a man working the evening shift in the area, frequently passing the entrance, recognized by many residents, as often seen around, and with a habit of stopping to smoke exactly in the shadowed corner, where light was uneven. Detaining this man for questioning did not provoke strong community reaction. On the contrary, it created a dangerous sense of relief. Having a suspect meant focus, focus meant progress. In the initial interrogation hours, investigators concentrated on his presence, rather than the behavioral chain. They asked about timings, walking routes, reasons for standing in that corner, and the initial answers were unremarkable. The man clearly remembered work hours, when he left, and insisted he went straight home afterwards. These statements did not immediately contradict, nor did they yield anything new. However, instead of returning to existing data to check fit with the behavioral model, the investigation began spiraling into one single detail: he stood too close to where Oliver disappeared. That excessive focus gradually became a funnel. Other statements, mismatched data, unlocked time gaps, all were pushed aside to make way for trying to make this suspect fit the hypothesis. Younger investigators were drawn into this rhythm, as it created a sense of control. One person, one interview room, one story to break. The man was detained longer than usual, in repeated questioning sessions, with questions rearranged to seek contradictions. But contradictions did not appear as expected. What did appear was fatigue and trivial details shifting under pressure, something that easily leads interrogators to believe something is not right. The first mistake in the investigation was not in detaining this man, but in the unspoken assumption behind it, that the approach to Oliver, if deliberate, must have stemmed from a prolonged and noticeable presence around the area. That assumption sounded reasonable, but it overlooked precisely what the behavioral analysis had pointed out earlier. The smoothness of the approach came from the ability to blend into the context, not from standing still and being remembered. A person too familiar to residents might be more easily identified in collective recollection, whereas someone who appeared only at the necessary moment could pass through without leaving an impression. By focusing all attention on the man who was often seen around, the investigation inadvertently bet on the reliability of witnesses' memories, something already proven to be unstable. Ultimately, it was objective data that forced them to step back. When cross-referencing the man's work schedule with the adjusted time markers, not based on the initial last seen, but on the independent time frame from trains, shifts, and locked doors, a discrepancy emerged. In the early scenario, he was still at his workplace when Oliver might have been approached. In the late scenario, he had passed through the area, but only in a short window, insufficient to carry out the entire approach, separate, depart sequence without being seen by anyone else. Trying to stretch the markers to fit only exposed another issue: the assumption of prolonged presence did not align with the very behavioral model they were using to explain the absence of a crime scene. Excluding this suspect did not happen with a dramatic moment, but with a quiet acknowledgement that logic had been bent to serve the need for a focus. The man was released without a formal apology. The file simply noted a brief line about insufficient grounds, but internally, the impact of that mistake was far greater. It showed that the greatest risk was not missing clues, but loving a hypothesis long enough to start seeing the world through its lens. When the investigation returned to the starting point, the lead investigator requested something seemingly simple: reread the entire behavioral analysis, as if the first suspect had never existed. The lesson learned needed no written record. If Oliver was approached deliberately, the person who did it was likely to have appeared only at the necessary moment, and vanished immediately afterwards. Clinging to a familiar face not only slowed progress, but also created the false sense that the danger had been contained. And with a 6-year-old child who had vanished in the city, that false sense was a luxury the investigation could no longer afford. Entering the second week after Oliver Bennett disappeared, the investigation entered a dangerous phase, not because of a lack of activity, but because of too many directions. After the first suspect was eliminated, the pressure to prove the file was still progressing caused the focus to unconsciously slide towards a false route, a chain of reasoning that sounded logical on paper, but increasingly drifted from what had been established through behavioral analysis. This route started from a simple assumption: if Oliver was not taken by someone familiar in the area, then he had likely left the City of London very quickly, before control rings could tighten. That assumption led to a series of familiar actions: expanding scans of inter-regional transport routes, sending alerts to neighboring units, checking reports of children sighted in suburbs, and reconstructing long-distance scenarios based on adult-assisted movement possibilities. In those days, the file thickened rapidly, but the content inside became increasingly diluted. Reports of children resembling Oliver appeared in various places: a boy in Croydon, a child standing alone near Paddington, a case in Essex, all recorded verified, then eliminated. Each time, the team lost more time, more manpower, and more attention. The long transport routes, which had shown no specific signs in the first week, were now dug into even deeper, as if digging long enough would produce evidence to justify the chosen direction. Meanwhile, the small details from the entrance area, where everything began, were gradually pushed to the bottom of the priority list, because they had already been examined. This deviation did not happen suddenly, it came from accumulated fatigue. After many days without a breakthrough, clinging to a seemingly open route provided a sense of action, even though the cost was fragmented thinking. Meetings began revolving around the question, if Oliver is outside London, where, rather than what allowed him to leave the entrance without anyone noticing. Behavioral analyses were mentioned less, as a completed background part, while new maps were continually hung up with arrows extending out of the city. It was in this context that important clues were overlooked, not because they were too complex, but because they were too small. A note from the first hours, about a physical detail near the entrance, not evidence, just something out of place, was marked as checked and unrelated. A short statement from an edge layer witness, about a fleeting uncertain moment, was filed under vague memories, because it did not fit the initial timeline. These pieces did not disappear from the file, but they were buried under dozens of new reports about places Oliver might have gone, even though no data actually pulled him away from the starting point. The lead investigator began noticing the deviation not from results, but from the language in meetings. The phrase "assuming he has left the area" appeared more and more frequently, even though it had never been proven by data. That was a sign that an assumption had silently become a premise. When he requested a review of what had been set aside in the first week, the initial reaction was hesitation. "We've already looked, there's nothing there, not relevant." But that last phrase made him pause. In the list of things marked not relevant, was a small detail, seemingly harmless, related to space rather than people. It was not physical evidence in a criminal sense, nor a full statement. It was simply a record of a very slight change in the environment, something that, if not asked the right question, no one would revisit a second time. At the time it was recorded, it did not fit the emerging investigation route, so it was set aside as background noise. But when the investigator reread the behavioral analysis, particularly the part about transitional edges and the smoothness of approach, that detail began to take on a different shape. The deviation of the second week was not a complete failure. It showed the investigation had gone far enough to recognize where it was heading. The days pulled into the false route exposed a worrying gap. While they were busy looking far afield, the closest questions had not yet been definitively answered. The investigator issued orders to narrow down again, not by canceling what had been done, but by setting it aside to return to the overlooked small pieces. Not to find a dramatic breakthrough, but to check whether something had been mislabeled, simply because it did not fit the prevailing assumption at the time. As the second week ended, the Oliver Bennett file was not short of data, it lacked focus in the right place. And in that thick stack of papers, a small detail, once deemed irrelevant, was waiting to be looked at again with different eyes, not to prove the investigation had been right, but to check what it had missed right from where everything began. Entering the next phase, the search for Oliver Bennett did not end with an official announcement, but with a series of quiet administrative decisions, one by one, altering the shape of the entire file. The resources mobilized en masse in the early days, enhanced patrol teams, continuous scanning of transport routes, cross-unit calls, began to be gradually withdrawn, not because hope had faded, but because reality forced reallocation of priorities. The City of London could not maintain indefinite emergency levels without new data. Each passing day without traces meant those resources had to return to serving other pending cases. The large-scale searches, which had shifted to the false route in the second week, officially stopped. The maps with arrows extending out of the city were taken down, replaced by a neater file board focusing on what was known rather than what could be imagined. This did not shock the investigation team, they had sensed it coming. The shock lay elsewhere when there were no longer search parties, no longer constant calls reporting possibly sighted. The silence became clearer than ever. Oliver did not appear, leaving no further signals that he was still moving somewhere out there. Internally, the file was reclassified, not resolved, not closed, but a coldly intermediate state, active unsolved. This meant the case remained open, still monitored, but no longer in emergency mode. Any new leads would be received, any related information recorded, but no more daily scans or wide search campaigns. For the Bennett family, the term sounded like a retreat. For the system, it was the only way to keep the case alive without exhausting all resources. The lead investigator spent time reorganizing the file in a new order, reflecting what the investigation had learned in the early weeks. Behavioral analysis was placed at the center, no longer an appendix. Assumptions proven wrong were clearly noted, to prevent them returning in another form. And particularly, the list of details once marked, not relevant, was brought back into the light once more. Not to promise an immediate breakthrough, but to ensure that when the file shifted to long-term status, it did not carry unacknowledged blind spots. Narrowing the search also revealed another reality. From this point on, any progress would come from rereading the past, not from chasing the present. No more random new witnesses, no more fresh traces. Everything depended on how the old pieces of information were restrung, and whether someone at some point in the future realized they had seen or known something that at the time was not important enough to mention. In the final meetings of the expanded search phase, the investigator emphasized a point that seemed obvious but easily forgotten. Narrowing did not mean abandoning the deliberate approach hypothesis. On the contrary, it acknowledged that if Oliver had been taken as smoothly as the analysis indicated, the person who did it had likely vanished from all sight very early. This explained why the expansion efforts only created more noise. The focus from here had to be patience, scarce in the early days but decisive later. When the file status was updated, a heavy feeling spread through the investigation team. Not a clear sense of failure, but the realization that the case had moved into a different rhythm of time. Oliver Bennett was no longer a child missing tonight. He became a name in the system, tied to an evening in 1969, and a file marked for revisit when conditions allowed. The lead investigator looked at the new classification board, understanding that from now on, every decision would have to bear the weight of years of waiting. The search narrowed, but did not disappear. It contracted into the pages, the analyses, and the small details once overlooked. In that silence, the Oliver Bennett file was kept open, not as a promise, but as a commitment that even without footsteps searching the streets, the question of how a 6-year-old child vanished in the city of London remained unanswered, and would not be crossed out simply because time had passed. The 1970s passed at a slow and heavy pace for the Oliver Bennett file. As the active unsolved status persisted without new leads, the boy's disappearance gradually left the daily desks of investigators and entered another space: storage. There was no ritual marking that moment. It happened through familiar administrative actions. The file was hard-bound, reports numbered, photographs placed in envelopes, witness statement tapes labeled. Everything was arranged according to the standards of the time, with the belief that order would help if it ever needed revisiting. But in that process, the nature of the case began to change. Oliver Bennett was no longer a child being searched for. He became a file to be preserved. The early 1970s were a transitional period for the London police force. Storage technology was still heavily paper-based, archives were filling up, and classification relied more on human skill than automated systems. The Oliver file, with no body, no charged suspect, was placed in the long-term missing persons group, a crowded but little-attended category. The investigators who had worked the case were successively transferred to other units, retired, or left the force. What remained were the document volumes, and a series of handwritten notes reflecting the thinking of a specific moment. In those years, the Bennett family occasionally still received notices that the file was not closed, that they would be contacted if any new information arose. But for the system, not closed did not mean under review. The file lay dormant in storage, accessed rarely when there was a report of an unidentified child, or when another case suggested vague similarity. Each time, an investigator would flip through the yellowing pages, read about the evening in 1969, the yellow-lit entrance, the absence of a crime scene, then place the file back. Over time, what had once been the focus, the behavioral analysis, the smoothness of the approach gradually became covered by the dust of storage habits. Index entries reading no physical traces, no identified suspect, no clear direction became static descriptions, rather than open questions. The case was officially termed what no one wanted to hear, cold case. Not because it had been solved, but because it had cooled in the flow of time and resources. A small but long-lasting misalignment occurred, not in the scene or statements, but in storage. When the Oliver file was moved from monitored to long-term storage, an auxiliary document set, including initial notes on the entrance space, some hand-drawn diagrams, and early observations on deliberate approach, was not merged with the main part. Instead of being in the same box as the official reports, it was classified under a different code, related to public space assessment, and placed in a shared auxiliary archive for multiple cases. No one deliberately hid it, it was simply the result of an ununified classification system, where a small decision by a storage clerk was enough to separate pieces that should have stayed together. The consequence of that separation did not appear immediately. In the rare times the Oliver file was reopened in the 1970s and 1980s, investigators only accessed the main part, where the story stopped at no crime scene and no direction. The auxiliary documents, with the early observations on deliberate approach and spatial transitional edges, lay in another archive, not mentioned in the main index. For those reading the file, the case seemed to lack an important layer of analysis, making it appear more dead-ended than it had been initially. In those years, the Oliver Bennett cold case existed like many others, mentioned in periodic reviews, brought out when there was a vague report of a missing child elsewhere, then folded away again. Each time, the absence of the auxiliary set went unnoticed, because no one knew it was supposed to be there. The file on the surface was complete, it simply lacked the very part, explaining why the initial search had shifted as it did. As the 1970s drew to a close, Oliver Bennett had vanished from the city's collective memory, but his name remained in the system, tied to a code number and a shelf position. A cold case was not the end of investigation, but a prolonged state of waiting, for new technology, for a witness to speak, for a misalignment to be discovered. In Oliver's case, that waiting lasted decades, partly because the right questions had been asked early, but the documents reflecting them were not where people looked. At that time, no one knew that a thin set of papers, misfiled in the wrong archive, would help keep the case cold longer than necessary. No one knew that when the file was revisited in the future, finding or not finding that set would determine how the entire story was reread. Oliver Bennett, in the 1970s, was not just a missing child, he was a dormant file, with a piece of memory misplaced, waiting for the day someone realized this case had never truly run out of data, only that it had been silently separated in the archives. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the Oliver Bennett file was not entirely forgotten, but each time it was awakened, it quickly fell back into the same familiar state of impasse. Reviews were conducted periodically, often when a new unit dedicated to cold cases was established, or when another disappearance bore a few similarities that reminded someone of an old name in the system. Each time the file was retrieved from storage, placed on a desk, and reviewed from beginning to end, but only the beginning to end that the system believed it had. No one realized that from the very foundations, the file was missing an important layer. In the 1980s, the approach to cold cases was still heavily focused on seeking surface matches. Investigators compared Oliver's description with reports of unidentified children, checked solved abductions from later years, and revisited lists of sex offenders active in London in the late 1960s. Those efforts were not superficial, they simply failed to touch the core of the case. The Oliver file, when read from the main archived version, told a familiar story: a child vanished, no crime scene, no decisive witnesses, no direction. After reading it, one easily reached the same conclusion as 30 years earlier: nothing new to exploit. In the 1990s, as technology and investigative thinking began to change, the Oliver file was brought out a few more times, this time, more modern methods were applied, reconstructing the timeline by computer digitizing statements, cross-referencing with newly formed interregional databases. But here, the old error continued to be preserved. The timeline was rebuilt, based on the last scene that had been dismantled in the early days, but that was no longer clearly reflected in the main file. The minute-hour contradictions, the existence of multiple witness layers, the observation that there was no single final marker, all had once been recorded, but were no longer where people looked. Thus, each time a new timeline was built, investigators unwittingly recreated the same flawed foundation, then wondered why every direction led to a dead end. No one in those reviews discovered that an auxiliary set of documents had been misfiled since the early 1970s. No one asked why the file lacked detailed spatial analyses, or why the approach behavior section was only mentioned as a vague hypothesis. To them, those gaps were simply signs of a case that had gone completely cold, rather than a structural error in storage. And so, the reviews ended in the same way, noting that the file had been reviewed, no new information found, recommending it remain a cold case. Meanwhile, the outside world changed. The City of London entered a phase of redevelopment, many areas around the Barbican were renovated, and the old entrance no longer retained the shape of that evening in 1969. Those who had lived in the block moved away, or passed on. Potential witnesses became increasingly hard to trace. With each passing year, the ability to revive direct memories diminished, making the Oliver file ever more dependent on what had been recorded from the start. And because that record was incomplete at a deeper level, every return only touched the surface. Later generation investigators, looking at lists of unsolved cases, saw Oliver Bennett as a familiar but distant name, no standout details to grasp, no clear errors to correct. The file lay dormant, not for lack of interest, but because it was continually confirmed as thoroughly reviewed. Each such confirmation, in reality, added another layer of dust. By the late 1990s, the Oliver Bennett file had undergone more reviews than most disappearances from the same era, but the paradox was that the more it was reviewed in the same way, the more immobile it became. No one detected the old error, because no one knew where to look. The misfiled document set remained undisturbed elsewhere, unnamed, uncompared, like a piece existing outside the view of the very case it belonged to. And so, as the 20th century ended, the Oliver Bennett file remained exactly where it had been for many years, in cold case storage, marked unsolved, regarded as exhausted of data. No one knew that what kept it dormant was not a lack of leads, but the fact that the most important leads had never been placed side by side since the earliest days. In the early 2000s, as City of London police undertook a widespread standardization of cold case files, the disappearance of Oliver Bennett was brought to the table again, this time not to seek further leads, but to conclude what the system believed was already clear enough. The context was very different from the 1970s or 1980s. Units were under pressure to streamline archives, clearly categorizing between cases still capable of progress and those considered to have reached reasonable investigative limits. In that process, the Oliver file, after more than 3 decades without breakthrough, was seen as a typical candidate for needing an official assessment, even if not a resolution. A review team was tasked with reading the entire file and producing a synthesized conclusion. They worked from what was available in the main document set: initial reports, records of failed searches, notes on the absence of a crime scene, no charged suspect, and the fact that all expanded search directions had yielded nothing. Within that framework, a familiar reading gradually formed. Oliver was described as a child missing in a complex urban setting, not ruling out the possibility of having left the area with an unidentified adult, and most likely, having died shortly after disappearance, though without direct evidence. The phrasing was chosen very carefully, avoiding absolute assertions, but enough to create a stopping point. This conclusion was entered into the file as an official assessment from the early 2000s review phase. It did not close the case, but placed a heavy full stop on how the system viewed the Oliver Bennett case. From that point, anyone opening the file would first read that synthesized conclusion, then the details behind it. In administrative reality, this had greater impact than any other decision. it shaped how the remaining data was interpreted. The problem was not that the conclusion was malicious or careless. The problem was that it was built on incomplete data, and more importantly, contradicted what had been established in the initial phase. In the early reports, still in the file, though no longer read closely, there had once been a clear observation that there were no signs Oliver had moved himself along long routes, that the disappearance behavior was smooth and deliberate, and that last seen was not a single marker. The early 2000s conclusion, by lumping everything into a vague possibility of having left the area and died, inadvertently overlooked those key points. This contradiction went unnoticed, because those writing the conclusion did not have the full picture. The misfiled document set, containing spatial diagrams and early behavioral analysis, remained out of reach. Therefore, when the review team sought consistency, they could only find it in the main file, where the sharpest details had been blurred over decades of copying and summarizing. The time contradictions, the warnings about misusing last seen as a foundation, had become historical notes, rather than issues to resolve. After the conclusion was recorded, the Oliver Bennett file entered a new state, colder than cold case. It was no longer seen as an open question, but as a question with the most reasonable answer under current conditions. This directly affected how subsequent reviews proceeded. Instead of asking "what have we missed?" people asked "is there anything strong enough to overturn the existing conclusion?" The burden of proof was reversed, and for a case lacking physical evidence, that burden was almost impossible to overcome. Internally, not everyone was entirely comfortable with this conclusion. Some veteran investigators, who had read the file in earlier years, noticed the mismatch between the new assessment and the old analyses. But when they revisited the file, the parts they remembered were no longer clearly present. Personal memory could not compete with an officially printed conclusion, and so, that doubt did not extend beyond brief corridor conversations. The early 2000s ended with the Oliver Bennett file carrying a new layer of interpretation, neat, seemingly reasonable, but lacking fidelity to the original data. The recorded conclusion did not kill the case, but it did something more subtle. It made the case harder to challenge. What contradicted did not disappear, it was simply placed behind a sign reading "reviewed." In the years that followed, anyone opening the Oliver Bennett file started from that conclusion, then worked through the older pages, and very few went deep enough to realize that from the beginning, this case had not fitted the very conclusion the system had assigned to it, that Oliver's disappearance was not like a story that had ended, but like a problem solved wrongly, yet submitted too early. In 2024, a small movement occurred entirely outside the police system that shook a file thought to have been settled for over half a century. It did not start with City of London police, nor from an internal cold case review, but from a chain of genetic data created for personal purposes. In the first 2 decades of the 21st century, genetic genealogy had developed along a path parallel to criminal investigation. Millions of people voluntarily submitted biological samples to commercial platforms to explore family origins, connect lost relatives, or simply satisfy curiosity about themselves. That data did not reside in police archives, was not under direct state control, but it existed, grew, and self-connected in ways no public system could replicate. In one automated comparison between open family trees, an algorithm detected an unusual connection. A DNA profile of an elderly man, born in the United Kingdom, showed a direct blood relationship to the Bennett family branch in London, but did not match any individual recorded as legitimate offspring in the family. The connection was not strong enough to indicate identity immediately, but clear enough to rule out random coincidence. Migration markers, estimated birth year, and distant relative branches all converged around a single gap in the family tree: a male child born 1963, 1964, missing in the late 1960s, with no adult record. This information did not automatically flow to police. It passed through multiple intermediaries: independent researchers specializing in relative tracing, a non-profit organization working with undocumented adoptions, and finally a lawyer, representing the man, who wanted to know if this discovery might relate to an unsolved disappearance. Only when those questions reached City of London police in the form of an official request did the system have to look at the name Oliver Bennett in a completely different way? The initial response was cautious to the point of coldness. The Oliver file had an official conclusion from the early 2000s. Any new data had to clear a very high threshold to justify reopening. But genetic genealogy was not a statement or speculation, it was a specific statistical indicator, with calculable probabilities. When independent experts presented the genetic model, they did not speak of possibly or sounds like, but of blood relationship ratios and family branches that could not exist without a missing individual from recorded history. The cold case investigator tasked with examining this information immediately recognized something worrying. The old conclusion in the file assumed Oliver had died early, but there was no physical evidence to support that assumption. If the external DNA data was accurate, then that assumption was not just weak, but wrong. The Oliver Bennett file, which had been placed behind a reviewed sign, instantly returned to an unstable state. What had been considered most reasonable under data scarcity now faced direct contradiction from a completely new data source. City of London police could not ignore this information, but neither could they accept it hastily. A small team was formed for independent assessment, separated from old conclusions to avoid confirmation bias. The first thing they did was not approach the man, but re-examine the Oliver file from the roots, this time with a very different question: if Oliver did not die, if he had lived under another identity, then which past investigative decisions had inadvertently obscured that possibility? When the file was officially reopened, the cold case status was no longer appropriate. It was reclassified as a case under reinvestigation with new data, even though most events had occurred in 1969. Investigators began re-examining core assumptions: the absence of a crime scene, the smoothness of the approach behavior, the possibility Oliver was led away without drawing attention. Analyses once blurred by the early 2000s conclusion now became sharper, because they no longer had to lead to death, but to a life severed from its roots. In that context, genetic genealogy data acted like an external key, not fitting the old lock, but forcing the system to change the lock. It did not explain where Oliver went on that night in 1969, but it answered a question the file had never dared put in writing: whether he could have survived. And simply having that question asked again, after 55 years, was enough to alter the entire trajectory of the case. In 2024, Oliver Bennett was no longer just a missing child in London's memory. He became the center of a collision between two data worlds: one side the paper file, old assumptions, and administrative conclusions, the other a global genetic network, developed beyond police control. When those two worlds met, the silence lasting over half a century in the Oliver file was finally broken, not by a confession or new witness, but by blood itself, something that had preserved the answer in a place the system had never looked. Reopening the Oliver Bennett file with genetic genealogy data only created a possibility, to turn that possibility into legal truth. City of London police had to go through a series of rigorous confirmations, unprecedented in the case's history. There was no explosive moment, no emotional announcement. Instead, many months of silent work, where each piece of biological, medical, and administrative data was placed beside another like thin panes of glass. Only a small crack would collapse the entire conclusion. The first step was biological. The investigation team did not approach the elderly man as an interrogation, but through a voluntary process, supervised by lawyers and independent experts. A new DNA sample was collected under standard medical conditions, cross-referenced with the initial genealogy data, and with samples from the surviving Bennett family branch in the United Kingdom. The results allowed no ambiguous interpretation. Direct blood relationship was confirmed with statistical reliability, exceeding the required threshold. Not a distant relative, not coincidence. This man belonged to the Bennett family biologically. But biology was not enough to confirm an identity missing for over half a century. The team moved to the second layer, medical. They scanned medical records from multiple systems, NHS in the UK, health facilities where the man now resided, and scattered old childhood records. Seemingly minor details began to align in ways difficult to fabricate: a mild congenital anomaly, matching the Bennett family's description, a teenage surgery leaving distinctive traces, blood type, allergy history, rare biological markers within the same lineage. No single piece was weighty enough alone, but the whole did not allow denial. The third layer, and most complex, was administrative. If Oliver was alive, how had he lived without leaving traces connecting to the past? The team scanned the man's chain of legal documents: birth certificate, school records, employment files, residency papers. Everything was legal, issued by proper authority, with no signs of forgery. But when timelines were placed side by side, a subtle discrepancy emerged. The birth certificate was registered later than the declared birth year. The place of birth was recorded in a locality with no corresponding birth record at that time. The legal guardian appeared then vanished from documents after a few years. Each detail individually could be explained. The chain could not. Investigators found no evidence of a large conspiracy, but of a legalization process that took place step by step, early enough to avoid cross-checking by the systems of the time. In the 1970s, registration, movement and identity changes, especially in cases of informal adoption, were not subject to the tight oversight seen today. A child could grow up with legally correct papers, but with the wrong origins, and once the system had accepted that chain of documents, it self-protected its legality by regarding everything prior as irrelevant. At this point, the investigation team faced a legal paradox. Biologically and historically, they had sufficient grounds to confirm that Oliver Bennett was alive, but under current law, the man in question existed under a different identity, fully protected by mechanisms of privacy rights, personal rights, and provisions related to disclosure of identifying information. The current identity was not just a name, it was an entire life legally built over decades. Linking it to a disappearance from 1969 could not be done without clear consent. This forced City of London police to change their approach. They could not announce Oliver Bennett as if resolving a standard criminal case. They could only confirm internally in the file that the individual missing in 1969 was alive, and every subsequent step had to respect the legal framework protecting the current identity. The Bennett family was informed through a closed process, with support from psychological and legal experts. No press conference, no new name announced, only a truth confirmed within the scope of those who needed to know. In the final cross-referencing process, investigators returned to the behavioral analyses from the early days, documents once misfiled and now recovered. The approach, separate, depart model, once seen as speculation, now became the only reasonable explanation for how Oliver disappeared yet survived. No violence necessary, just a decision, a chain of smooth behavior, and an administrative system loose enough to allow a new identity to form and exist legally. When all confirmation layers closed, the Oliver Bennett file was updated with a line never seen before: confirmed alive. That line carried no address, no photo, no new name. It existed only as a marker of truth. For the system, it was an investigative achievement. For the family, it was a belated shock. And for the man bearing the current identity, it was a question he might not want to answer. This confirmation did not close the story, it only changed its nature. Oliver Bennett was no longer a missing child to be found, but an adult, with the right to choose the degree of connection to his past. The law protects that right, even when the biological truth has been clarified. And precisely at the intersection between truth and the right to protection, this case entered a new chapter, quiet, undramatic, but carrying the weight of 55 years separated from his first name. Once the truth that Oliver Bennett was alive had been confirmed within legally permitted bounds, the investigation's focus shifted from finding the person to understanding what really happened on that night in 1969. City of London Police opened a retrospective investigation branch, with one sole principle: treat every old assumption as potentially wrong, and reconstruct events from the first minute, without relying on conclusions recorded over decades. This was not an emotional effort to patch the past, but a logical dissection, examining every decision, every classification label, every administrative choice that shaped the file's fate. They started from the moment Oliver left adult sight, returning to the method once applied, then abandoned, dividing witnesses by spatial layers, anchoring time with markers independent of Oliver, and completely discarding the concept of a single last scene. When placing these layers on the same axis, one thing became clearer than ever: Oliver did not vanish in chaos, but in an extremely short chain of transitions where every behavior could be perceived as normal. No explosive moment, no event large enough to freeze collective memory, and that very fact had caused the initial decisions, reasonable in context, to gradually drift from reality. The retrospective team traced each wrong decision, not to find someone accountable, but to understand their cumulative impact. The first decision was treating the entrance area as a potential crime scene in the physical sense, while the event's nature was smooth behavior. The next was building a timeline based on memories under pressure, instead of anchoring to objective markers. Then came over-focusing on a familiar-faced suspect, creating an illusion of control and diverting attention from the possibility that Oliver's keeper need not appear long or leave an impression. Each individual decision could be defended by professional logic. The chain could not. As investigators delved deeper into archived files, they recovered the once misfiled document set, spatial diagrams, notes on light edges, and early observations that deliberate approach required no violence. Placing this set beside contemporary administrative reports, a worrying connection gradually emerged. Not on the night of disappearance, but immediately after, a small administrative decision had opened the path for everything to unfold. Within 48 hours of Oliver's disappearance, an internal notice was issued regarding a child needing temporary care, received by a local social agency. The notice, read independently, mentioned no Oliver, no matching name, no matching address. It was classified correctly, routed properly, and stored standardly. But when the retrospective team placed it on the real timeline, against train markers, shifts and missing reports, the gap between the two events was too close to be random. Digging deeper, they discovered a chain of papers related to arranging temporary care for a boy without full birth records, processed urgently, due to special circumstances. No evidence of forgery, every signature real, every stamp valid. The issue lay in the system, then allowed parallel processing, without mandatory cross-referencing to open missing reports. A technical administrative error, not oversight, but no requirement to cross-check, had created two independent file streams. One searching for Oliver Bennett, and one legalizing the presence of a different child on paper. The team could not confirm who held Oliver that night, but they could identify who held him afterwards, in the decisive time frame. An individual appeared in the paper chain as temporary guardian, then vanished from records a few years later, leaving an identity the system had accepted. No signs of violence, no notable prior convictions. Everything fitted frighteningly with the initial behavioral analysis: smooth approach, separation from old context, departure via legal path. When reconstructing the 1969 night under this new light, investigators realized Oliver was not only led away from the entrance, but led straight into a system benevolent enough to protect children, but loose enough not to realize it was protecting the wrong one. The fault lay not in one individual, but in an intersection of time, process, and assumption. And that intersection had rendered all later searches meaningless, because Oliver had not gone missing in the way the system was designed to detect. Retracing each wrong decision brought no relief. It brought a heavier feeling that the truth had been very close from the start, but obscured by short-term reasonable choices. When the file was updated with retrospective findings, there was no prosecutorial conclusion. Only a cold but accurate note: Oliver Bennett's disappearance was facilitated by a chain of valid administrative errors, leading to him being kept beyond search reach from the earliest days. The 1969 night, when fully reconstructed, was no longer a metaphysical mystery. It was a lesson in how a child could vanish in a modern city, not because of darkness, but because of the light of processes assumed correct. And as investigators closed this retrospective part, they understood their work was not to fix the past, but to ensure the administrative errors that once led straight to Oliver's keeper would no longer be silent enough to repeat in the future. After reconstructing the 1969 night, and identifying the administrative error chain that removed Oliver Bennett from search reach, almost immediately, The team shifted to a harder and more sensitive question: by what mechanism a 6-year-old child could be taken out of London without triggering any alerts, and who contributed, actively or passively, to that process. This was no longer investigating a single personal act, but dissecting a system operating legally, but for the wrong purpose. Investigators started from the connection between the two once parallel files, the Oliver Bennett search file and the temporary care file for a boy lacking papers. In the early 1970s, moving children between localities under social care did not require identity verification processes like today. A decision signed at local authority level could allow transfer of care responsibility to another unit, especially in cases recorded as urgent or no identifiable relatives. Documents showed Oliver was reclassified, not by real name, but by a file code, mere days after disappearance. This required no forgery. It relied on an administrative assumption, the child unrelated to any open missing report, because no mechanism forced cross-checking. The signing individual was not someone with acquisitive motive, but an officer following process amid missing information. But that signature was the first link allowing Oliver to leave London on paper. The next step was involvement of inter-regional care agencies. Records showed Oliver transferred to an area outside Greater London for living environment stability. This move was approved quickly, as the system prioritized addressing children's immediate needs over tracing origins in cases without dispute signs. No one questioned why a suddenly appearing boy lacked clear family history. That was not rare then, especially in abandoned or special circumstance cases. In the paper chain, investigators identified key points: who signed, who overlooked, and who benefited, not in clear criminal sense, but structurally. Signers were authorized officers working within assigned responsibility. Overlookers were oversight systems, not requiring matching to open missing files. And short-term beneficiaries were the system itself: a child stabilized, a file processed, a case closed. But at a deeper level, one individual benefited directly and long-term, the one holding Oliver in the transition phase. Not a traditional abductor, but a temporary guardian exploiting gaps between processes. Records showed this person needed no hiding of Oliver. The system did that for them. As Oliver's new identity formed and solidified over years, school, medical, employment, the initial keeper's role faded, then vanished from papers, leaving a completely redefined life. Oliver's removal from London did not happen in darkness or by secret means. It happened in daylight, via legal routes, with authority figures' consent, but without his family's consent, and without full truth. This explained why all searches in and around City of London failed. Oliver was no longer there very early, and not in a way criminal investigation was designed to detect. The team faced an unacceptable reality: no single criminal moment, no point to point at and say, here, everything went wrong. Instead, a chain of legal choices, each defensible procedurally, but together forming a life acquisition mechanism, not by violence, but by paperwork. Oliver was not erased from the system, he was rewritten by the system itself. When investigators completed the analysis, they proposed no retrospective prosecution against 1970s signers. Statute of limitations, legal context, and decision nature made it unfeasible. Instead, their report focused on highlighting structural breakpoints, where child welfare, privacy, and identity verification were not in the same control framework. Precisely at that breakpoint, Oliver Bennett was taken out of London, not as a victim dragged away, but as a file smoothly transferred. The life acquisition mechanism for Oliver required no wide collusion. It only needed enough silence, enough legality, and enough trust in the assumption that the system is always right. And that made this case more frightening than any violent scenario, because it showed a child could be taken from his old life without anyone breaking the law, only no one seeing the full picture. When the life acquisition mechanism for Oliver Bennett had been fully dissected, the question was no longer whether there was criminal behavior, but whether that behavior still fell within legal pursuit limits or had been covered by time. City of London police worked directly with Crown Prosecution Service for months to reach a decision this file had never touched in 55 years. Arrest. This was not an emotional reaction to the truth Oliver was alive, but the result of a cold legal assessment of what the system could and must do. CPS approached the file with three clear charge axes. First, kidnapping in the legal sense at the time, taking a child from lawful family care without consent, regardless of violence used. Second, identity fraud, not in a single act, but in maintaining and reinforcing a false identity over years via administrative papers. Third, perverting the course of justice, deliberate acts or concealment that derailed Oliver's search from the start and ultimately led to impasse. The key point leading CPS to approve prosecution lay not in anonymous 1970s administrative decisions, but in the active role of Oliver's keeper in the decisive phase. Retrospective investigation showed this individual not passively benefiting from system gaps, but performing specific acts to maintain separation between Oliver and true identity, failing to report key information, providing false data when asked, and later actively avoiding contacts that could lead to matching the missing file. This was the legal boundary between system error and criminal act. The arrest warrant was approved quietly. No early announcement, no media leak. City of London police coordinated with local forces at the suspect's residence, executing the arrest in the morning, standard procedure for a sensitive case with historical and personal complexity. When police knocked, they found not a fugitive, but someone who had lived a lifetime confident that the paper chain once protecting them had legalized long enough to be irreversible. The suspect did not resist. According to the arrest record, the reaction was not immediate denial, but prolonged silence, a pause of someone understanding the paper chain once shielding them no longer held. At arrest, the suspect was fully informed of charges: kidnapping related to Oliver Bennett in 1969, multiple identity fraud acts over time, and perverting the course of justice through maintaining a false identity and distorting investigation potential. The first interrogation did not revolve around emotions or motives, but around the specific chain of behavior. The investigator placed each document on the table, each decision the suspect had signed, each instance of providing information to public authorities. No need for coercion, the documents spoke for themselves. CPS particularly focused on the period after Oliver had been taken out of London, when the suspect had ample time and opportunity to correct the wrong, to report, to return Oliver, but did not. That deliberate prolongation formed the foundation for the most serious charge. In parallel with the arrest, CPS issued strict directives on handling information related to Oliver. Oliver's current identity continued to be absolutely protected. The arrest was not described as foster parent, guardian, or any other emotional label. In legal documents, Oliver was referred to only as the victim of a historical kidnapping, while his current identity was separated from the public proceedings. This arrest marked the first time in over half a century that the justice system acknowledged that Oliver Bennett's disappearance was not merely an unexplained tragedy, but the result of actions potentially subject to criminal accountability. It also set a difficult precedent that time and administrative legalization do not automatically erase responsibility, especially when the consequence is a life deprived of its origins. As the suspect was taken away, there was no dramatic scene, no crowd, no cameras, only a file once closed too early, now opening at a stage where the law was compelled to intervene. For City of London Police and CPS, this was not the end point of the case, but the transition from investigation to legal confrontation, where every past decision would be placed under the light of a trial, and where the question was no longer, "Where is Oliver?" but who is responsible for him being taken from his own life. After the arrest was carried out, the case's focus shifted entirely to another battlefield: the prosecution file. This was where City of London Police handed the leading role to the Crown Prosecution Service, and also where the Oliver Bennett case faced its greatest barrier: statute of limitations. There was no longer debate about whether Oliver was alive, nor doubt about the chain of behavior that separated him from his family. The only remaining question was whether the law still allowed this case to be brought to trial. In the English legal system, not all offenses are subject to the same time limitations. Kidnapping is a serious crime, but when occurring in 1969, applying current law had to be considered carefully, under the principle of non-retroactive disadvantage. Identity fraud and perverting the course of justice posed a different issue. These were continuing acts, not necessarily ending when Oliver left London. CPS understood that relying solely on the initial behavior in the 1969 night and subsequent days risked the file being blocked at the courtroom door. Thus, the prosecution file was not built as a past story, but as a continuous chain of behavior. Prosecutors did not ask what happened in 1969, in a simple sense, but what was continued over the next 55 years. They focused on the suspect not merely benefiting from a past system error, but actively maintaining its consequences through repeated decisions. Debate over limitations was tense from the earliest internal memos. Defense argued that all core behavior, taking Oliver out of London, establishing the initial identity, had occurred over half a century ago, in a completely different legal context. They emphasized that their client had lived openly, without hiding, without fleeing, and that the state system had accepted Oliver's new identity for decades. According to that argument, prosecution now was not only time-barred, but contrary to the rule of law. CPS countered by dissecting each layer of the alleged behavior. They agreed that 1969 alone could not be relied upon, but they pointed out that maintaining a false identity was not an event, but a state continuously reinforced. Each time the suspect signed papers related to Oliver, each time information was provided to public authorities without revealing true origins, each time possibilities of matching the missing file were avoided, those were new acts, occurring at different times, many entirely within current pursuit limits. The key point of the prosecution file lay in a chain of very recent behavior. During the cold case reinvestigation, the suspect had formal contacts with state agencies, from confirming administrative information to indirect exchanges related to old social care files. CPS determined that in these interactions, the suspect had actively provided incomplete or misleading information, with the direct consequence of obstructing Oliver's identity matching when the case was reopened. These acts did not belong to the 1970s, they belonged to recent years. Here, the limitations barrier was broken. CPS argued that perverting the course of justice did not only occur when an investigation was open in 1969, but also when the suspect interfered with the retrospective investigation by maintaining the same false narrative that had existed for decades. Under this legal logic, limitations were not counted from Oliver's disappearance, but from the last time the suspect performed an act to distort the course of justice. The prosecution file also clarified that identity fraud did not end when the new identity was established, but continued as long as that identity was used to access rights, services, and legal recognition. CPS included specific examples: re-signed papers, updated records, benefits enjoyed based on untrue information. Each such act, according to prosecution argument, was a new link in the violation chain. Building the file this way was not to ensure conviction at all costs, but to surpass the minimum threshold for the case to stand trial. CPS was acutely aware that a 55-year case would face unprecedented scrutiny. Every limitations argument had to be tight enough not to collapse in the first hearing. Thus, the prosecution file was written cautiously, avoiding absolute statements, focusing on verifiable behavior markers. When the file was completed and submitted, it was not merely an indictment. It was a legal declaration that time does not automatically nullify responsibility, especially when behavior consequences continue in the present. For Oliver Bennett, this meant his case was not locked in 1969. It existed in every year his identity was misused. In every instance the system was led away from truth. The prosecution file closed with a core argument: this was not punishing the past, but ending a chain of distortion still in effect. That very chain, extended to very recently, had carried the case beyond limitations boundaries, compelling the justice system to act. From this point, the question was no longer, can it be prosecuted, but how that truth would hold in open court. The trial of the Oliver Bennett case did not begin with a dramatic indictment, but with a technical prosecution statement. This was a case of continuing behavior chain, not a single event from the distant past. Crown Prosecution Service understood that approaching the trial as a 1969 kidnapping would fail immediately. Thus, prosecution strategy was not returning to the past, but building a continuous 55-year timeline, where each point was a real decision, signed consequential. From the opening, the prosecutor actively eliminated emotional elements, no images of broken family, no tearful accounts. Instead, a large diagram displayed on screen a straight line starting in 1969 and ending in the present. The prosecutor made clear to the jury that their task was not pity, but determining responsibility, who did what, knew what, and continued doing what over half a century. The early timeline phase was presented very briefly. The night Oliver disappeared was mentioned only as a starting marker, not the debate focus. Prosecution emphasized they did not need to prove violence, nor intent to harm. The only thing to prove was that Oliver was removed from lawful family guardianship without consent, and that behavior created a legal consequence chain extending to today. From there, the timeline quickly moved to days after disappearance. Prosecution sequentially presented initial administrative decisions, misclassified file, temporary care transfer, failure to cross-reference open missing children lists. Each decision was placed against the legal context of the time, to avoid accusations of judging by modern standards. However, prosecution also noted that even by then standards, non-cross-checking was a gap, and the defendant stood precisely in that gap. When Oliver was taken out of London, prosecution did not describe it as furtive. On the contrary, they emphasized the outward legality of the entire process. This made the argument chillingly sharp. The defendant needed no law-breaking, no forgery, no fleeing. The defendant only needed to let the system operate on false assumptions and remain silent when opportunities to correct arose. The timeline continued through the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. This phase was presented as a flat file region, no major events, no disputes, no investigations. Prosecution deliberately did not prolong this part, as the purpose was not proving what the defendant did daily, but highlighting something more important: deliberate prolonged silence. Oliver grew up with a legal but wrong origin identity, and that identity could only exist if the person knowing the truth continued not speaking. When the Oliver file was reopened in the 2020s, the trial's rhythm changed. The timeline became denser, more detailed. Prosecution presented specific interactions between defendant and state agencies during retrospective investigation forms, meetings, formally asked questions. Defense argued that all core behavior occurred too long ago for pursuit. They emphasized their client did not evade, did not destroy evidence, did not obstruct investigation for decades, simply because no investigation occurred. According to defense, reviving this case was an unfair imposition on the past. Prosecution did not directly rebut that moral argument. Instead, they brought the jury back to a very recent moment, an administrative meeting where the defendant was asked about Oliver's origins in the context of file review. No pressure, no criminal interrogation, just a lawful question in a lawful process. Prosecution played the recording. The defendant's answer contained no clear lie, but it lacked one key piece of information, the information the defendant knew, and knew well. That very absence caused identity matching to continue being delayed, causing investigation to take many extra months. At this point, prosecution stopped the playback. No new evidence, no raised voice. They turned to the jury and posed one single question, the question the entire case revolved around: if a person knows that speaking the truth at that moment could end a 55-year investigation, and that person chooses not to speak, is that harmless silence, or an act continuing to pervert justice? The question did not require the jury to answer immediately. It cited no specific statute, but it locked the case's logic. From this moment, limitations were no longer a 1969 issue, but one of very recent behavior. Prosecution said no more. They let the question stand as an anchor, then returned to the timeline one last time. In conclusion, prosecution did not ask the jury to judge an entire system, nor to rewrite history. They asked only one thing: to determine the defendant had actively maintained a distortion chain, and that chain did not end until truth was forced to emerge. The timeline closed in the present, where Oliver Bennett was confirmed alive, not through confession, but through data and investigative persistence. The trial paused for jury deliberation, no commotion, no victory expressions. But in the courtroom space, one thing was clear: this case was not decided by one piece of evidence, but by a question of responsibility to truth, asked at the right time, with no escape. The courtroom fell silent as the jury returned to their seats. No signs of a hesitant decision. The presiding judge reiterated the basic principle: the Oliver Bennett case forced the justice system to confront. The court must not try history with emotion, nor correct an era's mistakes, but can only determine legal responsibility based on specific provable behavior. The verdict was read in proper legal order, starting with foundational charges. First, the court confirmed that removing Oliver Bennett from lawful family care in 1969 constituted kidnapping under the legal definition at that time. The court rejected the argument that absence of violence or injury meant the behavior lacked constituent elements. According to the court's finding, kidnapping's essence lies in depriving lawful guardianship, independent of execution method. However, the court also frankly noted legal limits when considering the initial behavior. Direct pursuit of the 1969 behavior, examined in isolation, faced barriers of limitations and historical legal context. But the verdict emphasized that this case was not prosecuted as a single event, but as a continuing behavior chain, where later acts were decisive. The verdict's focus lay in identity fraud and perverting the course of justice charges. The court agreed with Crown Prosecution Service argument that false identity was not a state frozen in the past, but one maintained, reinforced, and reconfirmed continuously over decades. Each time the defendant provided incomplete or misleading information to public authorities, each time administrative confirmation was signed based on untrue information, was viewed as a new act with independent legal consequences. In particular, the court devoted a significant portion of the verdict to analyzing behavior near the retrospective investigation time. Those interactions did not occur in ambiguous or ignorant context, but when the defendant was clearly aware the Oliver Bennett file was reopened for identity verification. Continuing silence or providing deficient information in that circumstance, according to the court's finding, crossed from passivity into active perverting the course of justice. Regarding the limitations debate, the verdict reached a principled conclusion: the statute of limitations cannot be used to protect behavior whose legal consequences still exist and are maintained in the present. The court determined that when an individual continues to benefit from a false identity and continues to prevent the possibility of restoring the truth, that behavior cannot be considered to have ended in the past. Therefore, the charges were not dismissed on grounds of being time-barred. On that basis, the court declared the defendant guilty of the charges of kidnapping, identity fraud, and perverting the course of justice. The verdict was read without accompanying moral condemnation, no emotional remarks about motive or character. The court merely confirmed that the elements constituting the offenses had been proven beyond reasonable doubt. After the guilty declaration, the court moved to content of particular significance to the case: the legal status of Oliver Bennett. The presiding judge emphasized that Oliver was not the subject on trial, nor was he obliged to change his current life. However, the verdict definitively confirmed that Oliver Bennett is the original legal identity, unlawfully deprived and restored in law. According to the verdict, Oliver has the right to be recognized in his blood relationship with the Bennett family, along with all legal rights arising from that recognition. At the same time, the court also clearly determined that Oliver's current identity continues to be protected by statute. The use, disclosure, or integration of the original identity into his current life depends entirely on his personal choice, not legal obligation. The court issued directives to administrative and police agencies. The 1969 missing person file for Oliver Bennett must be officially updated to confirmed alive, accompanied by a note that the current identity is protected. All related historical data must be amended to reflect the new legal truth while ensuring no infringement on Oliver's privacy rights. As the verdict concluded, the courtroom had no outburst of reaction, no cheers, no collapse. But one thing had changed permanently. The legal void lasting 55 years was officially closed. Oliver Bennett no longer existed as an assumption, a possibility, or an open question in the justice system. He was recognized as a human being with a disrupted history, not an erased one. The verdict did not return the lost years, nor heal all consequences, but it achieved what the system had failed at for decades, naming the truth correctly and placing it in its proper legal position. For Oliver Bennett, that was not the end of the story, but the first time, after 55 years, his story was acknowledged as real. The court's verdict did not close the Oliver Bennett case in an operational sense. On the contrary, it opened a new phase that City of London police cautiously called investigative aftershocks. When a 55-year missing person file is resolved by exposing a legal but flawed mechanism, the unavoidable question is, was Oliver the only case? Immediately after the verdict, an internal directive was issued, not to find more perpetrators, but to review historical missing person files with similar characteristics. Review criteria were built directly from what the Oliver case had exposed: children missing in urban spaces, no signs of violence, no clear crime scene, files quickly shifting to no traces, and especially cases involving social care or early administrative transfers. The review team did not search by name or address, but by behavioral patterns and file structures. They placed files on the same analytical framework: disappearance timing, search narrowing speed, early administrative decisions, and lack of cross-checking with other systems. This approach allowed them to see similarities previously unremarkable when files were examined individually. In the first weeks, results were concerning, not because of a large number of fully matching cases, but because of the repetition of the same type of gaps. Many files showed a very short period after disappearance, often days, when decisions on temporary care or administrative classification were made without mandatory cross-referencing to open missing lists. Each case had its own context, but the flawed structure was similar. Notably, the review team discovered that in many files, searches stopped not due to evidence of death, but due to prolonged absence of new signals. This, under the Oliver case light, suggested a worrying possibility: some children may not have gone missing, but been absorbed into the system similarly, rendering all search efforts meaningless from the start. In parallel with police, administrative agencies also conducted self-reviews. Social care archives from the 1960s, 1970s were reopened, not to find individual faults, but to identify operational patterns. Here, a common feature gradually emerged. The system then was designed to respond quickly to children's immediate needs, but lacked control points, ensuring that response did not conflict with ongoing investigations elsewhere. Combining results from both review directions, a concealment model, unintentional but systemic, began to appear clearly. It was not collusion between individuals, but separation between systems: police, social care, civil registration. Each system operated legally within its scope, but without mechanisms forcing them to communicate at critical moments. That gap was large enough for a new identity to form and exist unquestioned. City of London police paid particular attention to files once marked active unsolved, then gradually forgotten. Reapplying the Oliver case analysis method, witness layering, objective time markers, early administrative decision review, some files showed anomalies once overlooked or deemed irrelevant. Though not every case led to clear conclusions, absolute faith in the randomness of these disappearances was shaken. Investigative aftershocks also spread to policy. Internal reports recommended establishing mandatory cross-checking mechanisms between systems when handling unidentified children. These recommendations were not retroactive, but to prevent future recurrence. The Oliver Bennett case became a standard example in professional training programs, not for drama, but for how a legal flaw could persist decades. Notably, these aftershocks did not lead to a wave of new accusations. Instead, they created a quiet shift in how files were viewed. Investigators began asking different questions, not just who did what, but what did the system allow to happen. This was a significant shift, acknowledging responsibility lay not only in individuals, but in structures. As the investigative aftershocks phase ended, there was no long list of publicly reopened cases, but there was a foundational change. An invisible concealment model had been identified. It operated not by secrecy or conspiracy, but by lack of connection and good faith assumptions. And identifying this model, more than any sentence, became the greatest investigative legacy of the Oliver Bennett case. The case ultimately not only returned a name to a person, but forced the system to examine itself. Investigative aftershocks were not loud, not immediately shocking, but they left a quiet question, spreading in professional circles: how many files were once closed for reasonable but wrong reasons? The Oliver Bennett case did not end with a long-awaited reunion, nor close with a complete healing image. No embrace before cameras, no tearful breakthrough moment. When all legal procedures were complete, what remained was not a family returned to original state, but a belated truth and irretrievable time. Oliver, the man who was once the boy missing in 1969, did not leave the trial with a new identity, nor return to an old life. He left as the same person he had been for decades, but carrying information he had never had, that he once belonged to another place, another family, another name. Legal recognition did not create rebirth, it only confirmed a long-existing disruption. The Bennett family was not given back the child they lost. Instead, they were given a truth, that Oliver had lived, grown up, had a life beyond their reach. That truth was not simple comfort. It did not erase 55 years of searching, nor lighten years lived with unanswered questions. It only ended uncertainty, and in many cases, that full stop was heavier than the question mark. No one, in this story, achieved complete victory. The justice system did the right thing, but too late. Police persisted, but took over half a century to see what was obscured by its own processes. The person causing the separation was convicted, but the sentence could not return lost years. And Oliver, the center of it all, had no obligation to feel grateful or forgiving. He only had the right to understand what happened to his life. 55 stolen years were not 55 years imprisoned, they were 55 years lived, but lived in a different story, a story written by paperwork, by silence, by seemingly harmless administrative decisions. When truth was finally named, it did not shatter Oliver's current life, but revealed a layer of history never acknowledged. This case left no comfortable message. It did not say every loss can be fixed, or that belated justice always heals. Instead, it reminded that time is not neutral. Each year truth is delayed, is a year consequences are reinforced. And when truth finally emerges, it comes not as a miracle, but as an accurate record, cold, complete, non-negotiable. In City of London police files, the name Oliver Bennett is no longer tagged missing, it is tagged with another note, confirmed alive. But that note cannot contain the whole story. It does not record the family's waiting years, nor the life built under another identity. The file, ultimately, could only do one thing: place truth in its proper position. This case's epilogue does not point to bright hope. It ends with acceptance that some damages cannot be compensated, and some stories can only be retold, not rewritten. Oliver Bennett need not be seen as a symbol, nor placed in a hero or victim mold. He is a human being, with a deprived past and a present he must define himself. 55 years have passed, no one can return them, but naming correctly what was stolen, truth, identity, and time, is the final thing this system could do. And in the ultimate silence of the case, that is perhaps the only feasible form of justice. The Oliver Bennett story is not just a cold case solved after 55 years, but a direct mirror reflecting life in the United Kingdom today. A modern society deeply trusting in systems and processes. Oliver was not taken by violence, did not vanish in chaos, but slipped from his old life through proper procedure decisions, an uncross-checked temporary care file, an administrative identity, reinforced over years, and especially the prolonged silence of the person knowing the truth. Those very details make this story close to the present, because today's United Kingdom still operates on trust that the system will self-correct if wrong. The first and most important lesson is silence, at critical moments, is never neutral. In the story, just one full answer in a recent administrative meeting, when the Oliver file was reopened, could have ended the 55-year investigation sooner. This is especially meaningful in today's UK context, where citizens frequently interact with public authorities, from schools, NHS, to local councils. Not speaking due to trouble avoidance, thinking "not my turn," is sometimes how truth is delayed. The second lesson is the necessity of cross-checking thinking, not just in systems, but in personal life. The Oliver case shows when police, social services, and civil registration operated separately, a child could be absorbed into the system without questions. In modern UK life, from personal data management, child care, to vulnerable person protection, asking "has this been checked with others?" is not negative suspicion, but civic responsibility. Finally, this story reminds that time does not heal if truth is delayed. Oliver lived a full life in his own way, but that does not make 55 stolen years harmless. In today's UK society, where many historical issues, from child safeguarding failures to miscarriages of justice, are being re-examined, Oliver Bennett's lesson is clear: belated justice is still necessary, but timely justice always causes less harm. If you believe that truth, even belated, deserves to be heard, please subscribe to the channel, so we can continue following stories where justice must overcome time and silence. Thank you for staying until the last minute, and see you in the next video, where we continue naming correctly what was once stolen.